Hello and welcome to Lecture 8, Analysis of a Tariff. This comes from Chapter 8 of your book. We'll be discussing some of the issues surrounding tariffs. I thought we would start the lecture by talking about the recent US-China trade war. I've put 2020 there just because that's the year we're in and it's still ongoing. But it's been going for longer than that. And so this is just a little bit of information from the Congressional Budget Office. They reported their estimates of the US economic impact of tariffs applied to China primarily, but other countries as well in August 2019. So this data I'm sharing right now is from 2019. By 2020, tariffs would reduce the level of real US GDP by about 0.3%, reduce real consumption by 0.3%, reduce real private investment by 1.3%, and reduce real household income by $580. That's about a 1% reduction in real US household income in the US. Real US exports would be 1.7% lower, and real imports would be 2.6% lower as a result of the tariffs. So they explained that tariffs reduce US economic activity in 3 different ways. And this will be germane to our discussion in Chapter 8. So I thought we could start with this, but the CBO said first, consumer and capital goods become more expensive as a result of tariffs. Business uncertainty increases, thereby reducing or slowing investment. And other countries impose retaliatory tariffs, making US exports more expensive and thus reducing their attractiveness in these other countries. The CBO estimated the US had imposed tariffs on 11% of imports by January 2018. As of July 25th, 2019, retaliatory tariffs had been imposed on 7% of all US goods exports. CBO expects the negative consequences will remain, but have a smaller impact as we get to 2029 as businesses adjust their supply chains, i.e. they source from countries not affected by tariffs. So we can see tariffs in this trade war have already had negative impact on households in the US and also the nation as a whole and other nations as well. So the real question is, well, why do governments do tariffs? In this chapter, it discusses how tariffs almost always lower world well-being. So that's negative. Tariffs usually lowers the well-being of the nation imposing the tariff. So as we saw by the numbers of the CBO, that GDP, consumption, investment, and income are all negatively affected by this trade war with China. So there is such a thing that we'll discuss called the nationally optimal tariff, and that potentially can help one nation with causing the rest of the world to be the losers or the ones that lose out as a result of the tariff. A tariff absolutely helps those groups tied closely to the production of import substitutes. So in other words, the companies in the US who are facing strong competition from imports are the ones that would benefit from a tariff. Even when the tariff is bad for the nation as a whole, it would benefit those companies. So you can guess that those companies have lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and trying to get the U.S. government to add tariffs to the things that affect their ability to compete with outside companies. Even if that affects the rest of the nation negatively, they're really just looking out for themselves. So in general, tariffs from an economic standpoint are viewed as a negative thing. So a tariff is a tax on importing a good or service into a country. And there are different types of tariffs. Specific tariff is stipulated as a money amount per unit of import, such as dollars per tons of steel, bars, or dollars per 8-cylinder two-door sports car. So that's a specific dollar amount, a specific tariff. Ad valorem tariff is a percentage of the estimated market value of the imported good when it reaches the importing country. So the first one was dollars, second one was a percentage, third one, compound tariff. It's a combination of specific and ad valorem tariffs. So as I mentioned already, a tariff almost always lowers world well-being, usually lowers the well-being of each nation, including the nation imposing the tariff. There is such a thing as a nationally optimal tariff, which we'll discuss further. And as I mentioned, the groups tied closely to the production of import substitutes are the ones that are winners, while as the rest of the nation as a whole are losers. So let's take a look at this figure from your book. This shows the US market for bicycles with free trade. This is figure 8.1. So you can see here, we've got our demand curve and our supply curve. Because there is international trade, we have a world price. So US suppliers will supply at B, and US consumers will demand at D at that price. And so imports, M0, equal 1. So we see the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded. Quantity supplied is 0.6, and this amount demanded is 1.6. So total imports are 1. On this side is the price per bike, and along the x-axis, it is the quantity, millions of bikes per year. So the domestic producer surplus is area CBA. So you can see this CBA. So this is the producer surplus. Domestic consumer surplus is area FEC. So FEC. Without international trade, we would see an equilibrium right here, and the producers would have a larger surplus, and the consumers would have a smaller surplus as a result. Okay, so the effect of a tariff on domestic producers. We've got the same figure, and this is now figure 8.2 in your book. Same supply and demand. This is the demand curve. This is the supply curve. This was our original world price, but when there's a domestic price with the tariff, when the tariff is added, you can see it moves up the domestic price. So because the domestic price moves up, that means US producers are willing to produce a little bit more because the price is now $3.30. So they will produce 0.8 instead of 0.6. The domestic demand will go down, and you can see that. Before we were at point D0, it's going to slide along the demand curve up to D1. So now we have a much smaller amount imported. Remember, before we had an import of 1. This is 1.6, and this was 0.6. So we are importing 1 million bikes per year. Now we move down. I don't know what D1 is, but it's certainly less than 1.6, and S1 is 0.8. So the amount being imported is significantly less. So the shaded area of A here is the producer's gain from a tariff. So what happens is the producers gain this amount. The consumers, before their total amount was at this point, you can see it covered that whole area, but now it's moved up. So the consumer surplus is less, and the producer surplus has increased. So it's harmed consumers. It's the producers who are producing bikes are the only ones that have gained in this scenario. So now let's look at this a little bit more closely. The effect of a tariff on domestic consumers. You can see here, we've got the numbers now. This is 1.6 originally. It's come down to 1.4 demanded. So the shaded area equals the cost of the tariff to consumers. This is $45 million. So this whole area, H to G to E to C, is the loss to consumers. Before, the consumer surplus was F to E to C, but now we've cut out the shaded area. So now it's F to G to H is the consumer surplus. So as long as the tariff is not so high as to prohibit all imports, it also brings revenue to the country's government. Revenue equals the unit amount of the tariff times the volume of imports with the tariff. So that's area C in the diagram that we are looking at. You can see this, area C. Okay, so the government gains. They're the ones that are collecting the tariff. It increases the total cost of the imported product, which makes it so that US companies can also increase the price as a result of the tariff. This revenue could be used to pay for extra government spending, matched by an equal cut in some other tax, or serve as extra income to the government. So there is a government incentive to raise tariffs on goods because it's income to the government, and it also is a gain for those producers that are directly affected. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the net national loss from a tariff. So we're going to first look at the $1 one vote metric. So every dollar of gain or loss is just as important as every other dollar of gain or loss, regardless of who the gainers or losers are. So we're looking at this from a national level, not just those companies that benefit from the tariff, but everybody. The consumption effect of the tariff shows the loss to the consumers in the importing nation based on the reduction in their total consumption. That was area D in the diagram. Also, the production effect of the tariff is the amount by which the cost of drawing domestic resources away from other uses exceeds the savings from not paying foreigners to buy extra units. That's area B in the diagram. Now we're going to look at a small importing country, the net national loss from a tariff. We've seen in the previous figures, we've seen in the previous figures that the dollar value of the consumer losses exceeds the dollar value of the producer gains from the tariff. We've also seen that the country's government gains some tariff revenue. And in this figure 8.4 from your book, we're looking at the US market for bicycles in section A, and then just the market for imports in section B. And this is the same, we're looking at the same information, but in two different ways. Okay, so looking at section A of the figure, you can see again the tariff is added. The price goes from 300 to 330, and the effect of imports and who gains and who loses. So the consumers lose A, B, C, and D. Before the consumption surplus was from this point to this point to this point. Now it's all shifted up due to the tariff. So they've lost A, B, C, and D, the consumer has. The producers gained only A. So you see the consumers lost A, B, C, and D, but the producers only gained A. The government collects area C, so the net national loss are these areas of B and D, which we discussed before. So that's significant. Now, if we look at it just from an imports standpoint, our imports used to be at 1. We used to import 1 million bikes per year. Because of tariffs, now we're only importing 0.6 or 600,000. And the loss here is B plus D. Again, C goes to the government. Now let's discuss a situation where there's a large country and how the large country's movements or tariffs might affect the terms of trade. So we're going to discuss a concept called monopsony power. Monopsony power is when a nation has a large enough share of the world market for one of its imports that changes in the country's import buying can noticeably affect the world price of the product. The United States has monopsony power because we're definitely a large importer and a large enough nation, and we have a large enough share of the world market for certain imports that when we make a change, it'll affect the world price for the product. So if the country's demand for imports increases, its terms of trade deteriorate. If its import demand decreases, its terms of trade improve. So the large country will import less because the tariff increases the domestic price, so foreign firms export less and produce less. By removing demand pressure on foreign production, the marginal cost at the smaller level of foreign production is lower. With lower marginal cost and weak demand, foreign firms will compete and lower their export price. So figure 8.5, which is what we're seeing on this slide, which shows the national market for bicycles in section A and the market for bicycle imports, just the imports in section B. These two graphs are telling the same story. What we're seeing here, it shows the effects of a rather small tariff. It's a $6 tariff. So with free trade, we were at $297. We add a $6 tariff, brings us to 303. As in figure 8.4, the left side of this figure shows the market for bicycles in the United States, as I mentioned, and on the right side, the market for bicycle imports in the United States. Because the United States is a large country relative to foreign export capacity, the foreign supply of exports curve slopes upward instead of being a flat curve at a given world price. You can see here the foreign exports curve slopes up. This is because these are the exports supply to the United States. This is because the United States is a large country relative to the foreign export capacity or countries. So with free trade, the market for bicycle imports clears at the price of 300. And the United States imports 1 million bicycles. So you can see the 300 price, 1.6 and 0.6. That's the level of imports at M0, 1 million. This is what will be produced. This will be what will be demanded. The United States government then imposes a tariff of $6 per bicycle. We can see this tariff here. The tariff drives a wedge of $6 between the price that foreign exporters receive and the price that US buyers of imports pay. And even with this tariff wedge, the market still must clear. The quantity of exports from the supply of exporters curve, you can see it was here at 300. The quantity shifts up here to when the price of the tariff is included to 303. In figure 8.5b, which is we're seeing on the right hand side, the $6 tariff drives up the domestic price of imports to 303 and lowers the price charged by foreign exporters to 297. So this is the price, the consumer price. This is the amount that the foreign exporters receive as a result of the tariff. The quantity traded declines by a small amount to 0.96 million bikes. We can use these conclusions to show in figure 8.5a what is happening in the US market for bikes. If the domestic price rises to $303, the domestic quantity produced rises to 0.62. You can see that there, million bikes, and the domestic quantity demanded declines to 1.58 million bikes. So what is the effect of the tariff on the national well-being of the United States? Consumer surplus decreases. So remember, consumer surplus covered this area. Consumer surplus decreases by area A, B, C, and D. So A, B, C, and D, as we've seen before. The producer surplus increases by area A. So again, consumers are hurt more than producers gain. The government collects tariff revenue equal to area C plus E. The tariff of $6 per unit times 0.96. So before we were just looking at C, that was in a small country. Now with a large country, and we have the sloping curve, the US government gets both C and E as a result of this sloping curve, and foreign producers producing or selling at 297. So who really pays the tariff? For a large country, domestic consumers still pay part of the tariff, area C. So area C is paid for by consumers. The new wrinkle for a large importing country is that foreign exporters also pay part of the tariff, tariff E. So in the previous example, that full amount was paid by the consumer C, but in this case, the consumer only pays a portion of that because the US is a large country. So what is the overall effect on the importing country if it imposes a small tariff? The importing country still loses B and D. The triangles of inefficiency that we also saw for the small country case, the small loss is easily outweighed by the gain of area E, the part of the tariff that is absorbed by foreign exporters when they lower their export price. So for a suitably small tariff imposed by a large importing country, the importing country gains national well-being because of area E, and because it's larger than the B and the D. So for tariff rates that are not too high, the United States is better off than with free trade. In the case of a $6 tariff, the net gain to the United States would actually calculate out to be $2.82 million, which is the gain of area E here, minus the loss of B and D. Hopefully that makes sense. So this leads us to the idea of a nationally optimal tariff. So if there's a best tariff rate for the large importing country to impose, if it is purely driven by its own national well-being, the answer is yes, assuming that the rest of the world is passive. This best tariff is called the nationally optimal tariff, the tariff that creates the largest net gain for the country imposing it. For a large country, this optimal tariff lies between no tariff and a prohibitively high tariff. So we see in this figure, which can be found in your book, figure 8.6, the large importing country, in theory, can gain the most by imposing an optimal tariff. Here, the nationally optimal tariff is $50 per bike. So we go from $275 to $325, which is $50 per bike. And the importing country gains area E right here, area B plus D. Okay, so area E minus B plus D, I apologize. As in the previous example, the foreign country is harmed, losing areas E and F. So the foreign country loses E and F as a result. They may, as a result, retaliate. So the nationally optimal tariff assumes that the foreign nations are passive. They don't do anything to retaliate. But they may end up retaliating. But even without retaliation, the world is worse off because of the nationally optimal tariff. The global inefficiency equals area B plus D and area F. So this amount right here is what is lost around the world as a result of the tariff. So nationally optimal tariff is the tariff that creates the largest net gain, area E minus area B plus D, for the country imposing it, assuming the rest of the world is passive. The optimal tariff rate as a fraction of the price paid to the foreigners equals the reciprocal of the price elasticity of foreign supply of home country imports. So the danger is the rest of the world is worse off, risk of retaliation by foreign country governments. So that concludes our lecture on chapter 8. I highly encourage you reading it. And if you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email and we can schedule a time for a discussion. Thank you very much.